In this Patreon exclusive clip, I chat with author, journalist, and flow researcher Steven Kotler. This is the extended interview that made its way into my video, The Secret to Superhuman Performance.
It's technically defined as an optimal state of consciousness, where we feel our best and we perform our best. And more colloquially, right, it's any of those moments of rapt attention and total absorption. Get so focused on what you're doing that everything else just vanishes.
For Steven, the journey into uncovering the powerful effects of flow on human performance started, out of all places, back in the 90s when he became fascinated with the rise of action sports. In this video, we uncover the science behind flow, the positive impact it can have on our lives, and the triggers we can use to get into this optimal state of human performance. Hope you guys like it. So why don't you give me a little bit of an introduction? What have you been working on for the past couple decades? What has been your main driving force?
I tend to, a lot of my work is focused on a single question, which is, what does it take to do the impossible? And I'm really interested. History is littered with those moments in time when the impossible becomes possible, right? 4-minute mile was a miracle until it was the standard of excellence in running, right? Like, we see those transitions all the time, but I spent a lot of my career trying to figure out, why does it happen? What makes the impossible possible? And usually, you see, whenever you see the impossible become possible, you tend to see the two things coming together. And these sort of are the two sides of my career that people see, but they meet in the middle here, which is you see the intersection of kind of accelerating disruptive technology. So when the impossible becomes possible, you usually see people figuring out, how do you harness accelerating disruptive technology? And then you see people finding ways to extend human capability. And when those two things tend to come together, you tend to see a paradigm shift. So that's sort of been at the center of a lot of the work that I've done.
And a lot has happened over the past couple of decades with respect to both of those things, right? What have been some of the biggest changes in your mind that has helped the average person or enable the average person to level up in a way that they maybe wouldn't have before?
I think so, and I will say this over and over again. I've been, my core work is on flow, right? The state of optimal performance, peak performance, and I've been kind of working on the neurobiology of flow for 25 years or something like that. And the biggest shift is the change in kind of neural imaging technologies, brain mapping technologies. And for example, with flow, if you go back to the 1990s, people were trying to train flow, psychologists and coaches and whatnot, and nobody was very good at it. We were really crappy at it. And the track record went up and down. And even like the best in the world folks at it, it was a crapshoot. And starting in around 2007, 2008, the neural imaging technology caught up enough that we could kind of work backwards from, this is the neurobiology of flow, these are the states triggers, this is how the triggers work in our body and our brain. And for example, the Flow Research Collective, we do a digital training, Zero to Danger. It's our introduction to flow training. We use the standard flow short scale, which is the instrument everybody measures flow with, and we do pre and post testing. And on average, we will see an 80% jump in flow, which, first of all, three things you should know. One, there can be a substantial return to baseline if there are not other peak performance basics that are set up. So there's that, one. Two, it turns out flow is surprisingly easy to train if you're working from the neurobiology. But until we got there, right, until we understood, well, what are these triggers doing in the brain? How do they work? We couldn't get more of this. But now we've got that information, so it's made the training of high performance significantly easier. Big data is another thing, right? High performance, peak performance, all this stuff it's squishy. The psychology is squishy, and coaches, as a general rule, can be anywhere from 10 to 50 years ahead of the neuroscientists, right? And 50% of the coaches are out of their mind and they're making shit up, and it's crazy and it's bullshit, and they're some charismatic personality, and that's the only thing that's going on. It's basically it's a cult, but it's being called human performance, right? But that's what's going on. And 50% of it is really solid and cutting edge, and they're advancing the field. And trying to figure out what is what for a really long time was nearly impossible. But now we can start figuring out what is what. We've got the science underneath it, and it's really, the field's moving a lot faster than it's ever moved before, and that's really exciting. And it's totally, it's leaking down, you know what I mean? I'm looking at the books that you've got over there, and at least 3 of them, with excluding the power of now, are hugely influenced by these kinds of technologies, right? Most people don't think about the fact that, like, wow, I'm getting better in the gym because neuroscience has advanced, but that's actually what's happening, right?
Right. There's certainly a lot of people using buzzwords when it comes to human optimization and peak performance, and the separating and figuring out what's real and what's bullshit is becoming more and more difficult.
I think so too. One of the things I train people in is have a truth filter. I was trained both as a journalist and as a scientist, and both of those are professions that come with built-in truth filters. The scientific method is what it is in science. In journalism, when I was coming up, if I wanted to write a story for the New York Times and I want to call something a fact, source can tell me something. I got to get 3 other experts to confirm, and along the way in my career, I discovered that 3 is often not enough. And so like every fact that's in my books, for example, there are 5 the sources for every fact that's in my book. I'm really rigorous about having a truth filter, but I think just foundational peak performance, right? Human performance. If you want, accelerated learning is a core part of peak performance, right? You absolutely need to know how to learn, and you need to learn how to learn faster. One of the fastest ways to do that is to develop a truth filter. Elon Musk's first principle thinking is another example I write about in Bold, right? And these are all examples of truth filters, but you gotta have one, especially now in this space, because there's so much nonsense. And and again, I'm usually suspicious when there are nutraceuticals attached and things along smart drugs and a lot of those things. I'm just like, folks, take a look at the map of the human endocrine system and then tell me if you actually think this is working the way you're telling me it's working.
Yeah, it's about also probably finding the right people, finding the people that you trust that you can go to, whether it's for personal advice or simply somebody that you're following. And I think probably being a bit skeptical at all times, always like being like, well, I wonder how you might get to that. Like just trying to always look at the other side of things versus just taking everything for what it is. Like you see a lot of pitchforks and a lot of riots happening online because people see a meme and then they think like, oh, that's real, that actually happened. And then you look in the comments and you find out that, oh, actually this is the source of it and it was actually stolen from somebody else and manipulated in a way to make you be outraged by something. When you look at peak performance, and let's actually maybe even go back a little bit, because I do want to talk about flow. Like, how long has flow been studied for? And when did it start to be taken seriously as like a real thing that people could harness?
So it's interesting. Flow science is actually really old. It dates back to Nietzsche's probably the first, I call him the first high performance philosopher, and he wrote about flow. Nietzsche, when I call him the first high performance philosopher, he was the first philosopher post-Darwin. So Darwin blows up God, basically. And suddenly peak performance goes from something that you get from the gods to something that's based on biology and evolution. And Nietzsche's the first person who comes afterwards, and he realizes that, hey, wait a minute, if the body evolves, the mind evolves, and if you're interested in human performance, you have to take all this into account. And he talked about flow. He called the German word was Rausch, and Goethe was the first person who used Rausch as a term. But first studies on altered states and peak performance date back to the 1870s, and it was taken very, very seriously then. And then it sort of wobbled a little bit. Maslow obviously worked on this in the 40s and 50s. Csikszentmihalyi came in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, mostly in the 70s and 80s, coined the word flow, and did most of the psychology. And I would say by the 90s, it was being taken. Bill Clinton called Flow one of his favorite books. Tony Blair called Flow one of his favorite books. The Dallas Cowboys, who owned the 1990s, Jimmy Johnson was their coach. He credited Csikszentmihalyi's work with their Super Bowl wins, and so forth. So already in the 90s, we were taking it pretty seriously. And you could actually, there are major New York Times articles, 10,000-word articles in the Sunday magazine on flow, I think that date to 1988. So it was already taken seriously. What happened, and the reason you asked this question, is we were trying to figure out, well, where the hell does flow come from, right? And the number one theory was endorphins, right? Which are pain-killing, pleasure-producing molecules. And endorphins were sort of discovered in the 70s, and then we were sure they were runners high in the 80s, and they got associated with flow. And there was a woman named Kid you not, who was the president of the American Society for Neuroscience and one of the world's leading experts on endorphins, and she teaches at the University of Michigan. Very brilliant, but made a very critical error. I was talking to Gina Colada from the New York Times in 2001, I want to say, and said, yeah, this whole endorphins in the brain, runner's high, it's all a fantasy. It's pop culture nonsense. It's bullshit. And at that moment, it was like this perfect storm, like the New Age, the spiritual community had sort of been hovering around the fringes. They loved the word flow and blah. And the minute that happened, research in America, outside of the psychology, but even then, stopped, just shut down. People went, oh, Udo Kiel said that this is nonsense. This is obviously nonsense. And it went to Europe. And they've been really doing great work at the Karolinska Institute, went to Australia. There's a bunch of hubs of flow research. And it was shut down for like 5-6 years, probably really until I wrote Rise of Superman. But it's funny, in 2007, a team in Germany found endorphins in the brain during flow. The experiment got repeated in Italy in 2008. So yes, endorphins in the brain are definitely part of flow, and we've got really good brain imaging on this now. But you asked the question because right around late 90s, early 2000s, the New Age started getting really interested in flow. Even though their definition of flow is very different from what a scientist would talk about with it. And that's what happened. And so one of the things, one of my goals with Rise of Superman, which was kind of one of my big books on flow, I guess, was to put flow science back on a hard science footing. That was really my goal, is to say, hey, wait a minute, there's a massive amount of science that's been done, and this is not, there's nothing new agey about this. There's, really, really good research here, and this is a real thing, and that sort of stuff. But it was also, the other half of it was the training stuff was very difficult for people, same period, right? So people were trying to use it, and they couldn't wrap their heads around it, because if you try to come in from the psychology, it's complicated, it's squishy, it's weird, it's hard to figure out what the hell to do. But if you come in from the neurobiology, if you understand what the triggers do, how they produce flow, it becomes a lot easier.
You personally first started to get interested in all of this peak performance and flow by investigating a lot of the extreme sports that were happening in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And I know you obviously went through a lot of hardships and a lot of broken bones through that experience as well. But what was it about witnessing these athletes? Because obviously we're not really a lot today, at least I'm specifically not talking to a whole lot of athletes, but a lot of people who want to use these kind of techniques to improve their personal and work lives. So how do we go from these athletes to figuring out how flow can adapt outside?
Yeah, there are obviously two different answers. That on the inside, what was so puzzling, it was first, it was the obvious, more impossible feats got done in a 7 to 8, 9, 10-year period than ever before in history, and it was being done in action sports. And this was, insane. Rules that had been in place since the beginning of sports, don't do this or you'll die, were being broken on a daily basis. That in itself was fascinating. As you said, I broke a lot of bones. So what ended up happening is I would snap this or that. I'd take 3 or 4 months off, and I'd come back, and stuff that was literally, oh, this is impossible, it'll never be done, nobody. They weren't just doing it, they were iterating on it. They were doing tricks on top of the tricks on top of the tricks. And you were like, what the hell is going on? Is A. B was action sport athletes. If you go back to the 1990s, this is a punk rock, rowdy, irreverent bunch of people without a lot of natural advantages. They don't have a lot of money, they don't have a lot of education. Most of them came from crappy childhoods. And yet here they are, right, on a semi-regular basis, redefining the limits of what's possible. So that was amazingly fascinating, right? And I had broken, as you pointed out, a lot of bones along the way. And, my core question was still, what does it take to do the impossible? And while it was flow inside of the action sports, I took my question out of action sports and pretty much into every other domain imaginable. And, flow still shows up. Every time you see the impossible become possible, flow's sort of at the center. And there are a lot of neurobiological reasons that shows up. But it's interesting because people still associate flow with athletics, and yet we know, for example, almost everybody spends roughly 5% of their work life in flow, usually in micro flow states. So flow, one of the things people are often unclear on, flow, it's technically defined as an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. And more colloquially, right, it's any of those moments of rapt attention and total absorption, get so focused on what you're doing that everything else just vanishes, right, and all aspects of performance go through the roof. So that's a spectrum experience, like any other emotion, right? You can be, a little bit angry, or you can be homicidally murderous. It's the same emotion, right? Flow is the same way. You can have a state of micro flow or a state of macro flow. Now, flow is defined scientifically, psychologically by 6 core characteristics. Complete concentration in the present moment, the vanishing of self, your sense of self disappears in flow, time dilation, so time passes strangely, a couple other things. This is how we measure flow, right? If these 6 characteristics show up, it's flow, right? Microflow, these 6 show up, but they're dialed down really low. So I'll give you a really simple example. When you sit down to write a quickie email, you look up an hour later and you realize you've written an essay, right? And maybe your sense of self disappear, but like you had to go to the bathroom and you didn't notice, right? So your body function, it sort of like shut down your awareness of body function. So your whole sense of self didn't vanish, you didn't meld into the universe. There was nothing mystical going on, but you forgot to go to the bathroom, right? Because you were so absorbed in what you were doing. That's microflow. Macroflow, other end of the spectrum, until the 1950s, and Maslow did his work, we thought it was a mystical experience, right? We, like the early work on flow, you go back to like the early scientist, William James, right? First American psychologist who was working on flow right at the turn of the century. He thought it was a mystical experience, thought it was an experience common to religious and spiritual people only. And then Maslow, Abraham Maslow in the 50s is doing a big study on success, going around the world talking about the most successful people he can find. Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, he did a historical analysis, Frederick Douglass, all these people, and they all have found ways to put themselves into flow and use that for high performance. That was his first discovery. His second discovery is everybody in his study group was an atheist. They were all atheists, and so suddenly he was like, well, wait a minute, this can't be a spiritual, mystical experience common to people with, with religious backgrounds, because these folks are all atheists. There's got to be something else going on. But macro flow, it often feels like a full mystical experience. Time slows down, self vanishes, you can become one with everything. We now know biologically, neurobiologically, where all those weird-ass experiences are coming from. Like, I can tell you why time passes so strangely in flow and why your self vanishes, or why you might feel like you're one with the universe. But, at the time, those are just weirdo spiritual experiences, or you're very, very spiritual and you're having really powerful mystical experiences. Take your pick, right? Now we know that's macro flow. So there's this spectrum of experiences, and most people, to go back to your original question, we spend 5% of our work life in micro flow, often without even noticing it. So flow is not, while it's very common among action sport athletes, it's less common among bat and ball and track and field sport athletes. And where it tends to show up a lot more is anything creative is very, 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 very flow-based. And these days, and when I say creative, I don't just mean like you're a painter, you're a filmmaker, you're a writer. I mean, you're a coder, you're an architect, you're an engineer, you're a scientist. Like all these fields where your creativity is kind of core to the work you're doing, those are very high flow pursuits.
So this might be like an obvious answer to a lot of people, but I'm still like curious as to the why behind it. Like, why should we focus and invest our time and energy into figuring out how to achieve these states of flow? Like, what are the real benefits that we'll get from it?
Depends on whose numbers you go by. And again, there's a lot of science underneath this. So these are huge numbers, and they sound ridiculous to me to say out loud without giving you all the science behind them, but I'm not going to bore you with all the science behind them. I'm just going to give you the numbers, but I want you to know this is emotionally difficult for me. Mm-hmm. McKinsey did a 10-year study. They found that motivation and productivity can go up 500% in flow, 500%. Creativity, and this is work done at the Flow Research Collective. Some was done at the University of Sydney, some was done at Harvard. We see creativity spike 400 to 700%. Learning, depending on whose numbers you're going by, the Department of Defense did some work. They found learning spikes 230% in flow. Other studies were done where they were taking novice marksmen and training them up to the expert level in 50% less time in flow. Cooperation, collaboration go through the roof. Empathy and ecological awareness, which is your ability to perceive the natural world, go through the roof. And I think most importantly, and we know this really clearly, it's one of the most clearest findings in psychology, in the history of psychology, is the people with the most flow in their lives are the people who score off the charts consistently for overall well-being, life satisfaction, meaning, and happiness. So if forget peak performance, you want life satisfaction, meaning, happiness, well-being, just simple, like I want to enjoy my life, this is the best pathway. In fact, in positive psychology right now, they talk about 3 levels of happiness that humans can achieve on this planet. Level 1 is just happiness. How do you feel right now, right here? And it turns out there isn't a whole lot you can do to change your normal happiness. It's because there's something called emotional set points, which basically means that sometime, it happens like first 12 years of your life, nobody's exactly sure, but definitely by age 12, they get set up and you have a low one and a high one. And in between is the entire bandwidth of emotions you're going to experience on the planet, right? This is as happy as you're going to be and this is as sad as you're going to be. We now know you can move them a little bit. They're not as hard and fast, but there's not a whole lot you can do there. And positive psychology has, like, we all know the tools, mindfulness, right? Respiration and mindfulness, gratitude. There's a couple others, exercise, get enough sleep at night, nutrition, right? These are the positive psychology basics. That's all you can do. And as Dan Harris pointed out, the best you're gonna get out of this shit is about 10% happier, right? Like, he's not wrong with that number. Then there's the second level. They call it enjoyment or engagement. It's literally a high flow lifestyle. So this is anybody who, this could be action sport athletes, filmmakers, creators, or whatever. Or, I mean, I live in northern Nevada and I'm surrounded by really talented construction workers who work construction so they can fly fish or ski or hunt, or right there. Very high flow lifestyles with a different kind of job. So all that's the second level of happiness. The top level of happiness you can have on this planet is meaning, and it's literally a high flow lifestyle with the thing that produces flow is attached to purpose, something bigger than yourself, something that makes the world a better place. But that's literally it. So why should anybody care about flow? Well, okay.
It's a decent start.
It's a decent start.
I first started to really look into flow last year when I was going through a bit of anxiety. And it was really just, I happened to come across this. I think I was listening to the audiobook, A Drive by Daniel Pink, and he happened to talk about how these peak states, these states of flow have shown to help reduce anxiety and depression. And then I came across your work and I happened to find the same exact thing. So
it's because the stress, when you move into flow, the stress hormones are flushed out of your system. That's what it's doing. Oh, okay. That's what's happening.
And does it like last throughout? Like, if we can find more moments?
So you're okay, maybe I misunderstood.
So like once we're, say like we enter this peak state of flow and we're there for an hour, 2 hours, then does it affect the rest of our days? Apart from, obviously I could see when we're so sucked into the moment doing something, that's going to make us feel better. So, but then like at night, will we also feel the effects from that reduce in anxiety?
It's a great question. And I don't want to talk out of my butt, right? Like, so I don't know if I've actually seen any direct research on it. I don't know. It's like, we know flow massively reduces anxiety in the moment. And by the way, personally, so the calm you get on a back end of a flow state, which you do, you get a deep calm. Not only are the stress hormones going, mostly that's an increase in serotonin and oxytocin that shows up at the back end of a flow state, and that will last longer. Now, where it gets complicated is flow is a cycle. Okay, so you flow, and flow is actually the third step in a cycle. And on the back end of a flow state is a recovery phase. Flow is expensive for the body to produce. Certain neurochemicals, certain nutrients, blah, blah, blah. And so if you are not recovering in recovery, your body's going to get stressed really, really fast because it's it's low on energy, and it's low on, like, it can't solve problems at that particular moment in time. It has used up all its energy. And so if you ask yourself to try to, then you're going to really fuck with the system and you're going to have problems. So as long as you respect that recovery phase and actually use it for recovery, that calm will persist because the serotonin and the oxytocin will outlast most of the flow state, and it'll carry over. The other thing is, there's a lot of, like, again, you have to do the recovery phase, because the recovery phase, all your feel-good neurochemistry is gone, right? So I always say, one of the things that's great about flow is this huge creative state, lots of ideas come in, right? They all seem really good. They're not all really good. Yes, human performance is up through the roof, but you're still gonna have bad ideas, right? Scott Schmidt, old extreme skier, used to say, flow makes me feel like Superman up until the moment I'm not. Right, but so this recovery phase on the back end for creatives especially, it's fantastic. I will reread my writing. Like, I want to write in flow, but I'll reread. I won't try to do the edits, but I will circle anything I don't like in the after state, because I've got no feel-good neurochemistry. So if I like it, then it's going to actually be good, right? Because there's nothing swaying my opinion. So you can use this to your advantage, this downswing that's on the back end of it. And what I always tell people is, in this state, again, if you want your question was, how do I get the calm to last? And so I can't tell you exactly how long it lasts or how profound it is, because there hasn't been good research, but I can tell you how to extend it, and what to do with it. And one of the other things that I always tell people is, in the recovery phase, on the back end of a flow state, you've got no more feel-good neurochemistry. Literally, like, it takes a while to replenish the stores. You can't take your emotions very seriously. So I always say, at the back end of a flow state, the hangover rule applies. And what the hangover rule is most everybody who's been drunk once or twice or 3 times knows that when you're hungover, your brain says all kinds of negative, awful shit to you, right? Like, I'm hungover and I'm dumb and I'm ugly and I'm gonna die and I'm a failure and I get it right, all that stuff. But I've been hungover a few times, so I can say to myself, oh, good, I hear you. And that's really important. And why don't you tell me about that shit tomorrow? Because today, because I'm hungover, I'm going to watch football, right? Like, I just know. Don't take myself too seriously, because this is it's a hangover, right? You're hungover on the back end of a flow state. Similar thing. You're depleted of feel-good neurochemistry. You're not as dehydrated, but you're depleted, right? That you can't take your emotions that seriously on the back end of that. Otherwise, that anxiety is really going to come roaring back. So there's a protocol here. It requires a little bit of maturity, but you can really extend it for a while, I think.
I could see that there's a lot of potential difficulty, and I can tell you from my own personal experience, getting into flow. Probably one of the biggest barriers for people, especially creatives and students, to getting into flow is procrastination. Do you know much about why we procrastinate?
Yeah, so it's
how to overcome it?
Yeah, it's totally, you're smack in the middle of flow research and you're gonna laugh. So we talked earlier, flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. The most important, what they call the golden rule of flow, is what's known as the challenge skills balance. So let's forget the neuroscience behind the triggers, but what flow follows focus. It only shows up when all of our attention is in the right here, right now, right? So that's what all the triggers do. They're all ways of driving our attention into the present moment. Challenge skills balance is the best of those ways, and it says we pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge of the task slightly exceeds your skill set. So you want to stretch but not snap. It's outside your comfort zone, but just outside. So if I were to explain it emotionally, I would say it sits, this challenge skills balance, the balance point sits not on, but very near the midpoint between boredom, not enough stimulation here, I'm paying no attention, and anxiety, whoa, way too much, I'm paying too much attention. In between is this sweet spot. They call it the flow channel, right? So here's what's interesting about procrastination. Procrastination, 95% of the time, is one of 2 things. It's always you've misdialed the challenge skills balance. And you're procrastinating because either the challenge is too hard, right? And it's making you anxious, so you're putting it off and you're putting it off and putting it off. Or, just as common, the challenge is too frickin' boring, right? And here's the funny thing about the human brain, and here's the funny thing about humans. We actually are hardwired for peak performance. The body will move in the direction of peak performance on its own. Procrastination, one of the things you find out inside of peak performance is quite often your emotions don't mean what you think they mean. A lot of emotions mean something totally different. Procrastination is one of those things. We hear about it in society, we think, oh, I'm a bad person, I'm procrastinating. No, you're getting a signal from your brain that's saying you are not in the right state of mind to perform at your best, so it's trying to tilt you. If you put something off till the night before, so suddenly, what happened? You turn the challenge dial way the fuck up, and suddenly you can pay enough attention to drive yourself into flow and get the work done, right? So what we tell people on that one is, because you don't want to put things off to the night before, because just too many things could go wrong. We call it life, right? So shit can go wrong. You don't want to do that, so up the challenge level. I'll give you a simple example from my own life. Then we'll talk about the other side when you're too anxious. Especially when I was coming up as a writer and as a journalist, I mean, man, I would take any story you gave me, right? I'll write about whatever. Some of those stories were less than interesting to me. So, because I didn't want to put it off till the night before, for all the obvious reasons, I would do things like, okay, how would Charles Dickens write this story? How would Hemingway write? So I'd try to write the story in the voice of Hemingway, because I've turned the challenge level up. I'm a month out, and suddenly I'm interested, right? And if it's the opposite, if it's the anxiety thing, right, then the problem is your challenge is too big, and you've got to chunk it down into something more manageable that sits in that challenge skill sweet spot. But if you dial it correctly, procrastination is going to go out the window, because the anxiety is going to go away or the boredoms are going to go away. So the causes of your procrastination, you can remove them by playing with this challenge skills dial. And bonus, you're going to get into flow. When you do, if you get it right, it'll drive you into flow. The quality of the work you're going to do is so much better as a result. So, like procrastination, people are procrastinating. That signal is your body saying, hey man, woman, hey person, you are not in the state to perform at your best. You're getting a signal from your body that's saying you're wired for high performance and you've got it wrong. So play with the challenge skills balance tends to be the solution there.
And then in terms of the how, now that's clearly a how for procrastination, but I know you've talked about other ways in which we can get into a state of flow,
Sure.
like whether it's increasing the risk or the challenge, there's other ways. So I know that there are many of them, and when we're looking at the individual level, what are some ways that, other ways that people can get into flow?
There's a whole, how do you drive focus in the present moment? One of the big ways you do it is you release dopamine, right? Dopamine does a lot of different things in the brain. One of the things it does is it's a focusing drug. And there are 5 different flow triggers that are all dopamine triggers. So risk produces dopamine, right? Whenever we take a risk, we get dopamine. Dopamine is how the brain fires us up for taking that risk. Whenever we encounter novelty, we get dopamine. Complexity produces dopamine. Unpredictability produces dopamine, and so does pattern recognition, which is the linking of ideas together. So all of these things are flow triggers. And risk, let's just go to risk. I don't just mean physical risk, right? That would social risk, emotional risk, intellectual risk, and it's totally individual, right? Shy woman just has to walk across the bar and introduce herself to, the guy she's interested in to pull this trigger, right? Laird Hamilton, he's got to surf 100-foot waves. So it's very, very, very individual, and you can pick and choose. Novelty is a really simple one, right? And I spend a lot of time reading textbooks these days, which is not the most exciting thing to do, but I love to do it. I always go someplace new because I want the novelty, because it's going to produce dopamine, which is going to tighten focus and hopefully drive me into flow while I'm reading. But one way or another, when you get more dopamine in your system, learning rates go up as a general rule also. So going and doing my homework, basically, the hard stuff I've got to do my job, just in different coffee shops that I would not normally go to, that little bit of novelty is enough.
That's interesting, because a lot of people would think that I need peace, I need quiet, I need to go to my study where
you
do all my reading.
You need to be able to keep.
But in a novel environment, can change everything.
Yeah, I tend to, I do a lot of work. I'll look for hotel rooms in places I haven't been that have balconies with beautiful views. That's literally, so I'll have the quiet of like, and I will just sit in a strange place and look out at the beautiful view and read my textbooks. And I do that fairly frequently. But I have to read a lot of textbooks to do my job, and that helps.
That's a really interesting way to kind of, I guess, just reshape how you could enter a state of flow and reshape how you can, yeah, go ahead.
The only thing I was just thinking as you were talking, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
No worries.
But, I tend to, there are a lot of people in the human performance space who want to point you at a technology or a substance. And certainly in Stealing Fire, I talked about both categories for state shifting and performance. I'm uninterested in either of them. And one of the reasons is I want a minimalist approach to peak performance. I'll give you the example I always joke with people at is, when I was coming up as a journalist, there were 4 or 5 or 6 different occasions where I was shot at or caught in the crossfire, right? On no of those occasions could I look at the guy who was shooting at me and say, "Excuse me, sir, would you mind putting down your AK while I take this substance so I can wait for it to hit and I perform," right? Like, that doesn't happen.
Wait 45 minutes.
Right, exactly. Or, hold on, let me put on my EEG device and do some, no. Peak performance, I want it when I want it. And so, the psychological triggers, it's funny. People don't love them. They're like, "Oh, novelty. He's telling me to go to a different coffee shop or the challenge skills." They're not sexy at all. Right? This is just basic biology. They're really pretty simple, and they're really minimal. And most people don't like them for that reason. They want something fancy. They want the substance. They want the technology. They want the complicated, but it doesn't actually have to be that way. And I like these psychological triggers because they're so minimal, and they're portable. They go with me right, and are useful. So I don't know if that's useful to me, but as you were talking, it popped in my head.
Yeah, I was wondering if they're transferable somehow. So say, and I don't know if you would consider this a flow state, but I've found when I do cold plunges and I'm going to 35-degree water and I come out, it just pulls me into the present moment like nothing else. Are there things like that I can do that and then I just start writing and
well, so that's a different flow trigger-ish, known as deep embodiment. And deep embodiment is quite literally, we pay more attention to the present when multiple senses are engaged in the present. So working through doing. In fact, a number of years ago, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, kind of godfather of flow psychology, and a University of Utah educational researcher named Kevin Rathunde went looking for the highest flow environments on Earth outside of action sports. One of the things they found was Montessori education. And there are a number of reasons, but the main one is they often call Montessori embodied education, learning through doing. Don't just read about agriculture, go out and plant a garden kind of thing. And obviously planting the garden engages multiple senses, right? So cold plunge, right? You are, first of all, suddenly your skin is really paying more attention than it probably has in a long time because you've just radically changed that, and then you're stepping back out of it. It's a full sensory experience, right? If you've got cold water in your skin, it's taking in everything. So in and of itself, you're at the front edge of a flow state. I would, if you want to layer in a couple more flow triggers on the back end of that, right? If you come out of your cold plunge and go to your work and you've got your challenge skills balanced, totally dialed, and you're in a novel environment, yeah, you're probably dropping right into flow, right? Because you've just stacked 3 triggers. You've shifted a lot of neurobiology in yourself. And yeah, will it work every day for 3 weeks? No. But will it work once or twice? Yeah. And if you can start to train your brain that this is how you get into flow, then it actually becomes a habit and a cue and all those things.
Yeah, even do you use anything like that when you give a public talk, or have you just done it so much that it's not as necessary?
In terms of what?
Say if you give a talk in front of 10,000 people, going into that cold, if you just woke up, got out of bed, and went right into the talk, you'd probably be stuttering and mumbling and might find it hard to click on in that way. Have there been things that you found that kind of get your brain working in a way?
So it's interesting. Josh Waitzkin, who there are a handful of people in peak performance who I think are truly excellent, Josh being one of them. And Josh spends a lot of time thinking about cues and, creating little routines at the front end of flow. And I sort of have them, right? But they're not I try to, the one that I do, and I guess I do this, and I didn't even think about it this way, but I talk about it a little differently. So flow, there's a shift in brainwaves in flow, and your brainwaves go down to the sort of the alpha theta borderline. Doesn't matter, but my point is when you wake up first thing in the morning, your brain is mostly in alpha. Beta is where we are when we're awake. It's a fast-moving wave. It's where you and I are right now. Alpha is slower. It's sort of daydreaming mode. You wake up there. I try to get to my desk before my brain kicks out of alpha because I want to put it back to that alpha theta borderline. So like my ritual is I will go from, bed to my office, pushing the coffee pot on my way because I've set it up the night before, and that transition is really fast for me, and I actually try to be writing within 2 minutes of being awake.
Really?
Yeah, and I go for, and there's a way I write. I edit what I wrote the day before I start writing, because when you're editing, so I said pattern recognition is a flow trigger, right? When you link ideas together. Editing. Oh, this isn't the right word here. This would be a better word. That's pattern recognition. So it's packed with flow triggers, and there's less pressure. I'm not facing a blank page. I'm facing the page I wrote yesterday. So I'm editing it, and my brain's already in alpha, right? Because I haven't really quite woken up, and I'm editing what I wrote the day before, and every time I'm starting to notice patterns, I'm getting a little bit of dopamine and a little bit of dopamine. And so by the time I get to the blank page, right, when I have to actually start creating out of nothing, I'm already close to there. So yes, I do a little bit of that in my own life. I don't do it as much. I do, I will say, and this is, and I've talked about this before, the one trigger when as an athlete, I'm a skier, whenever I'm going to ski something dangerous on the chairlift, 30 seconds before I get off the chairlift, the earphones go in and I start wiggling my hips like this, and it looks really stupid if you're sitting next to me on the chairlift. You're like, what are you doing over there, man? You twerking? What's up with that? And what I'm really trying to do is loosen up my hips, right? Because they're one of the tightest spots on my body, and I'm about to ski something really gnarly that's going to require me getting really deep into them. But that embodiment signal, coupled with the music going in, just the last 30 seconds before I get off the chairlift is enough to drive me to the edge. And then I always try to, easiest way to pull the deep embodiment trigger is to encounter multiple G's, 0 G's, or polyaxial rotation. So fancy words. Multiple G's meaning lots of gravity, right? 0 G's, weightlessness, and polyaxial rotation is spinning, right? And the point is that we're gravity-bound creatures who are forward-facing. We move in one direction. So whenever you do weightlessness, weightedness, or spinning, your body goes, what the fuck is going on? And it pulls that deep embodiment trigger almost instantly. So the combination of like just wiggling my hips and getting myself into my body a little bit, and the first thing I will do when I get off that chairlift is I will try to jump off something. It doesn't have to be big, but I want that feeling of weightlessness, because so I have tiny little rituals. It's not a big, Josh has has people go through like 10, 12, 15-minute protocols. That's too much for me. Like first of all, I don't have that kind of time in my life, and most of the people I work with don't have that kind of time in their lives either.
You might need 15.
I don't. Yeah, I need like a 2-minute little thing, 30-second little thing, and that works for me. But I also, and I always say this, personality doesn't scale, biology scales. So what works for me is guaranteed not to work for you, right? So figure it out for yourself, conduct your own experiment, because the only thing I can guarantee you is what works for me is not going to work for you.
Right. It is interesting, though, that you mentioned kind of the building of momentum and rewarding yourself with through the editing process to build up to the blank page. Because that's certainly something that I've noticed but never quite figured out as a writer. So a lot of my work is writing, and a lot of it's sitting down and starting a video fresh with nothing else, just the idea, which is very daunting to figure out where to start, how to start, and how to. So
I'll take it one step farther, and this is another thing we train people in, and this is something else, by the way, that both Josh Waitzkin and I. It's interesting. He learned it from Hemingway, and I learned it from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But we both found the exact same tidbit, which is with writing specific, but I train people to do it in whatever you're doing. Quit when you're most excited. So stop your work when you're really fired up about what you're doing, because the next day when you wake up, you're going to carry that energy in. So the way I always tell people this is, And people are always like, why would you like waste a flow state or something, right?
not-
Right? Exactly. Right. So that's the standard reaction. Fair enough. My point is that usually by the time you notice that you're actually really excited, you're on the tail end of it already, because you've now suddenly pulled back out of whatever it is you were doing far enough to go, oh my God, I'm really excited, right? When you were actually most excited, you were doing the work. By the time you're noticing that your excitement, you're already on the tail end of this. And the reason it works is your excitement chemicals, norepinephrine and dopamine, have a limited shelf life. 20 minutes is at maximum potential. Why do you think TED Talks are 20 minutes long? Because the brain's two focusing chemicals last 20 minutes in peak concentration.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've heard that too from, it was either Stephen King or Stephen Pressfield. They have just a word count that they hit every day. But that makes sense, where it's not like, you know, you hit 500 words or 1,000 words.
Yeah,
and then
well,
you're
that's a totally different, mine is in the challenge skills balance. So in the start of a book, it's 500 words a day. In the middle of a book, it's 750. At the end of a book, it's 1,000. Because I'm moving it up. It's getting easier, right? But yeah, Hemingway used to quit mid-sentence. I mean, like literally sometimes like you would halfway through a word and he would walk away because he was that intense. Garcia Marquez said, I read this in a Playboy interview he gave in the 50s, and I don't know where they reprinted. Somewhere in college I saw the reprint of this thing, and that's where I got it. But I've been doing so the ritual to start out with, so I don't have to face the blank page, and I always quit when I'm excited, so I come back to something I'm fired up about. And those two things, because momentum, as you pointed out earlier, momentum's the ball game.
Yeah, that seems probably like a skill to build, and something worth experimenting with to see if, maybe did I cut myself off too short here? Yes. Do I need to go a little bit further?
Yeah, exactly.
And then you'll figure it out.
And you'll figure out exactly what's right for you. And by the way, I also think it varies day to day, right? Like, how deep is my focus right now? How much longer can I sustain it? Like, you know, am I going to be this excited 5 minutes from now? Because if it's building, well, I want to ride it a little bit long, right? Like, so that you're right. A, you got to run the experiments, and two, I think it changes on a day-to-day basis, a little bit, not a lot, but enough that you want to sort of pay attention to it.
One thing that I found was interesting that you talked about is has some minimalist undertones about less is more in terms of the brain function, what's going on inside the brain when we're in a state of flow. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh yeah, okay. So that's
common misconceptions.
Yeah, that's funny. So for most of the 20th century, the idea about peak performance was what we now call the 10% brain myth. It's the idea that we're only using a small portion of our brain, say 10%, at any one time. So peak performance, it must be the full brain on overdrive, right? And it turns out we had it absolutely backwards. In flow, peak performance, we're not using more of the brain, we're actually using less of the brain. The technical term is transient, temporary, hypofrontality. Hypo, H-Y-P-O, it's the opposite of hyper. It means to slow down, to shut down, or deactivate. And frontality is the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's right back here. Really powerful part of your brain. Logical decision making, long-term planning, sense of morality, sense of willpower, all this stuff is prefrontal cortex. In flow, the brain performs an efficiency exchange. Brain has a fixed energy budget, right? Uses a ton of your energy, 25% of your energy goes to run your brain, and it's only 2% of your body mass. So it's a huge energy hog, and it's got a fixed budget. So the first order of business for the brain in every situation is, how do I conserve energy, right? So flow requires all this extra energy for focus. So where does it come from? The brain shuts off non-critical structures. It says, you don't need this right now. I'm going to turn it off and give you that extra energy for attention. So in flow, we're not actually using more of the brain, we're using less of the brain.
So The Future is Faster Than You Think is your new book. Tell me a little bit about the new book and what can people expect from it?
The book is, so Peter Diamandis, who started the X Prize, and I have worked together on a number of books, and we started with a book called Abundance, and then we wrote Bold, and now this is the third in what we're calling the Exponential Mindset series. So Abundance is a book about individual lines of accelerating exponential technology, right? And exponential is a fancy word, but it means the technology doubles in power on a regular basis. The classic example that almost everybody's familiar with at this point is Moore's Law, right? Which basically says your computers get twice as powerful every 18 months, and yet the cost stays the same, right? It's because the number of integrated circuits in a computer chip doubles every 18 months, where the cost stays the same. So what we now know is that as soon as a computer becomes a digital technology, meaning you can program it in the ones and zeros of computer code, it jumps on the back of Moore's law and starts accelerating exponentially. In abundance, we said, hey, look, there's like 12 of these technologies that are doing this. They're all some of the most potent technologies the world has ever seen. And if we harness them, we really have the ability to kind of go after global grand challenges: poverty, energy shortages, healthcare problems, blah, blah, blah. Bold was a book essentially for entrepreneurs who wanted to do just that, right? It was a how-to in a sense. So the future is faster than you think. What has started to happen is those formerly independent lines of exponential technology are starting to converge, and they're overlapping, and you're getting like a whole is greater than the sum of its parts effect. And these were already the most powerful technologies the world had ever seen. So you look at like the classic, the easy example, and this is a dark example, but it's a good one, is robotics a very powerful technology. Artificial intelligence is a very powerful technology. On their own, they're revolutionary, but that you put them together and suddenly technological unemployment for tens of millions of people is a real issue, right? So that you get these stacking effects that are accelerating our acceleration. Well, you have like 10 to 12 of these technologies coming together, and what it means is, it means we're gonna see more change. We're going to experience over the next 10 years roughly 100 years of technological change. So think back to 1919, think about all the technological change that's happened till now, or 1920, and then realize we're going to do that in the next 10 years. So what the book does is, in the beginning, the first 4 chapters of the book, it says, look, these are the 10 technologies. These are a bunch of secondary forces that are getting unleashed by these technologies. And then we go industry by industry: entertainment, healthcare, longevity, education, energy, finance, real estate. Take like 12 biggest industries on the planet, and we look at how they're going to be totally reinvented over the next 10 years. And I think the book is, it's twofold. I think like for people who are interested in getting out in front of it, more wealth is going to be created in the next 10 years than has in the past 100 years. So the opportunity is enormous, immense, incredible. And for people who want to get out in front of it, we wrote a roadmap, right? Like, this is what's coming. This is, right? Part of the book was so people would stop being so afraid of the future, but part of it is a roadmap for entrepreneurs, for creatives who really want to get out ahead of this, and legacy organizations. You're an established Fortune 500 company. You know, legacy organizations, they were built for safety and security. They're not built for radical, rapid change, and yet that's what's coming. So for legacy organizations, it's kind of a little bit of a warning across the bow, saying, hey, look, this is coming, and this is massively disruptive, and your organization is probably not built for it, so you might want to get out ahead of what's coming. So that's really the book.
Amazing. One final question to end on. So for students who have just graduated and who are moving out into the workforce and preparing for the next decade, what advice would you give them? What should they know in order to...
Same advice, I think. I'm going to, not contradict, I'm going to give you 2 different things. One is, the advice is always the same. Follow your passion. And let's demystify that, right? Passion is nothing more than the intersection of multiple curiosities. So find 3 or 4 things that you're curious about, figure out where they intersect. That's a passion. Attach it to a grand problem in the world that you want to see solved. That's a purpose, right? That's 4 or 5 different intrinsic motivators. And when you have an intrinsic motivator, you get focus for free. Focus for free is everything. Right? Most of achievement is paid for in energy, and most of that energy is spent on focus. So if you can get your intrinsic motivators lined up, right, by figuring out what you're passionate about, figure out what you're passionate about, what purpose it serves, and then how that attaches to a couple of these exponential technologies, now you've really got a blueprint for your future in a business. The other thing I want to tell people about where the opportunity is coming, because it's not where you think it is, and I'll give you a simple example. What we're seeing is mashup industries, right? Technologies are coming together, industries and markets are coming together, and I'll give you a simple example. So there's a guy on our board at the Flow Research Collective. His name is Adam Gazzaley. He teaches neuroscience at the University of California in San Francisco. Brilliant. And this year, 2020, he has a product coming out, and it's a video game meant to treat cognitive decline in older adults, and it's been approved by the FDA. So it is the first video game in history that has been prove to treat a condition, and it will. So you're an older adult, you're over 60, and you're starting to lose your sharpness. You can literally go to the doctor, and he can prescribe, play this game for an hour 3 times a week for the next 6 weeks, and it resets. Cognitive decline has like 11 different things that go wrong. 3 or 4 of them can be reset, and this video game will literally reset your brain to that of about a 20-year-old. That's all besides the point. That's amazing, but that's besides the point. My point is, 4 or 5 years ago, I was giving a big talk to NBC, to all the top executives, C-suite, NBC, and I was like, you guys don't get this, but 10 years from now, healthcare and entertainment are going to be the same frickin' industry. Because 10 years from now, your choice is, do you play a video game, or do you play a video game that makes you smarter? Do you watch a movie, or do you watch a movie that does X, Y, or Z for you? That's what's coming, right? So for the established movie companies and television companies, the news is not good. But right, so you're seeing mashup markets at places if I would have come to you 10 years ago and said, hey, healthcare and entertainment, they're coming together and they're going to be the same industry sometime in our lifetime, you would have just started laughing probably. But here we are 10 years later, and so I think that a lot of the opportunities are between categories in places we're not really looking, but that's really what's interesting. And so, simple advice, first of all, figure out what you're passionate about. Figure out where those curiosities intersect, what you're passionate about, how it commands to purchase, which of these exponential technologies can you utilize underneath it, and then start looking at these weird-ass intersections, because there's no competition right now, and first mover advantage is first mover advantage is first mover advantage. I can't believe I just said that.
Love it. Anything else that you want to add before we wrap up?
No, that's cool.
Cool, Steven. Thank you so much,
My
man.
pleasure.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.